Hey guys, tonight we journey back to a world so quiet, so slow, and so unimaginably different that even the concept of a busy day didn't really exist yet. There were no clocks, no notifications, no deadlines, just light, hunger, weather, and the steady rhythm of survival. Imagine waking not to an alarm, but to the faint glow of dawn creeping across the horizon, your body naturally stirring as the cold night air begins to soften. This is where our story begins. The early human day did not start with urgency. It started with awareness. Before even sitting up, a person might lie still for a moment, listening. The crackle of dying embers from last night's fire, the distant call of birds, perhaps the rustle of wind through tall grass or leaves. Every sound mattered. It wasn't anxiety, it was instinct. A quiet, constant scanning of the world. Slowly, the group would begin to wake. Early humans rarely lived alone. They existed in small bands, perhaps 20 to 40 individuals. These were not just random companions, but deeply familiar faces, family, extended kin, and lifelong allies. There was no privacy as we understand it, but also no loneliness in the modern sense. Everyone belonged somewhere. The morning itself was unhurried. There was no need to rush because survival was not about speed. It was about consistency. Some individuals would stretch. Others might tend to the remains of the fire, gently coaxing it back to life. Fire was precious. It wasn't something easily recreated, so keeping it alive overnight was essential. A few careful breaths, a handful of dry material, and soon thin trails of smoke would rise again, followed by the comforting flicker of flame. Children would wake in their own time, often staying close to adults. There was no structured schooling, no formal teaching sessions, but learning happened constantly. A child watching someone shape a stone tool or observing how food was prepared was already being educated. Knowledge passed through demonstration, repetition, and quiet imitation. Food, of course, was central to the day, but not in the way we think about meals. There was no breakfast, lunch, or dinner. Eating was opportunistic. If food was available, it was eaten. If not, the body simply waited. Hunger was a familiar companion, not an emergency. As the sun climbed higher, the group would begin to move with purpose. This was often the time for foraging or hunting, depending on the environment and the group's needs. Foraging was more reliable and likely took up a large portion of daily activity. Small groups, often including women, children, and some men, would spread out across familiar territory, scanning the ground and vegetation with practiced eyes. They weren't wandering randomly. These landscapes were deeply known. Certain areas were remembered for seasonal fruits, others for roots or nuts. A slight change in the color of leaves might signal something edible. A broken branch might hint that animals had passed through recently. The act of gathering food was quiet and methodical. Fingers brushing against leaves, gently pulling berries, digging carefully into soil to extract roots. Conversations, if they happened, were soft and sparse. This wasn't a silent world, but it wasn't filled with constant chatter either. There was a kind of calm focus, a shared understanding of the task. Meanwhile, hunting, when it occurred, required a different kind of energy. It was not a daily event for many groups, and success was never guaranteed. Hunting could take hours, even days, with long periods of tracking and waiting. Early humans were endurance specialists. Rather than sprinting after prey, they might follow it slowly over long distances, exhausting the animal over time. But even on a day without a hunt, there was always something to do. Tools needed maintenance. Stones had to be shaped, edges sharpened. This process, known today as knapping, involved striking one stone against another to create sharp flakes. It required skill, patience, and precision. A well-made tool could mean the difference between a successful day and an empty one. Back at the camp, others might be engaged in different tasks, preparing food, repairing simple shelters, or simply resting. Rest was not seen as laziness, it was necessary. Energy had to be conserved. Unlike modern life, where activity is often constant, early human life moved in waves of effort and recovery. As midday approached, the heat would begin to press down, especially in warmer climates. This often brought a natural pause. People might gather in shaded areas, sitting or lying down, conserving energy. There might be quiet interactions, someone picking through collected food, another gently grooming a companion, removing dirt or insects from hair. These small acts were deeply social, strengthening bonds within the group. It's important to understand that early humans were not in a constant state of fear or struggle. Yes, dangers existed, predators, injuries, illness, but these were not every moment concerns. Much of the day was actually quite calm. There were long stretches of time where nothing dramatic happened at all. Afternoon would slowly shift the rhythm again. Depending on the success of earlier efforts, there might be more foraging, or perhaps a return to camp to process what had been gathered. Food preparation was simple but deliberate. Plants might be cleaned or crushed, meat, if available, cut and shared carefully. Sharing was fundamental. There was no concept of personal ownership over food in the way we think of it today. If one person had success, the group benefited. This wasn't generosity, it was survival strategy. Cooperation ensured that everyone had a better chance over time. As the sun began its descent, the group would gradually come back together. This was perhaps the most social part of the day. The fire would be fully revived now, its warmth and light creating a central point for gathering. The flickering flames not only provided heat, but also safety, keeping predators at a distance. Evening was not filled with entertainment as we know it, but it wasn't empty either. There may have been storytelling, simple narratives about past events, lessons, or observations. These stories weren't written or recorded, but they were remembered. They carried knowledge, warnings, and identity. The human voice in those moments been one of the most powerful tools. Not loud or theatrical, but steady, rhythmic, almost hypnotic. Perfect, in a way, for drifting into rest. People would sit close together, sometimes touching, sometimes leaning against one another. There was comfort in proximity. The warmth of bodies, the sound of breathing, the gentle crackle of fire, it all created a sense of security. Night, however, was not entirely without awareness. Someone might remain partially awake, tending the fire, or simply keeping watch. This wasn't a formal shift or duty roster, but more of a natural pattern. Light sleepers, older individuals, or those stirred by small noises would wake, and then drift back to sleep. And sleep itself was different. It wasn't always one long, uninterrupted stretch. It could be broken into segments, with brief periods of wakefulness in between. Dreams, too, may have held a different kind of significance, though we can only imagine what they felt like. So when we ask, what did early humans actually do all day? The answer is both simple and complex. They lived, not in a rushed, fragmented way, but in a continuous flow of awareness, effort, rest, and connection. There were no wasted hours, but also no obsession with productivity. Every action had a purpose, yet there was space, vast stretches of quiet time where nothing urgent demanded attention. And as the fire slowly dimmed and the stars stretched endlessly across the sky, another day would come to a close, not marked by a clock, but by the natural turning of the world itself. The embers had not fully gone out when the first faint light of another day began to press against the horizon. It came slowly, almost reluctantly, as if the world itself preferred the quiet of night just a little longer. A few members of the group stirred, not all at once, but in a gentle ripple, someone shifting, another sitting up, a child turning in their sleep and pulling closer to a warm body nearby. The air was cooler now than it would be later, and for a brief window of time, the world felt balanced, neither too cold nor too hot. This was often when movement began again. Not rushed, not urgent, just necessary. On this particular stretch of days, the group had been noticing signs. Small ones, easy to miss if you didn't know what to look for. Tracks in the soft earth, broken stems, droppings that were still fresh. Somewhere nearby, animals were moving through the land with some regularity. And while foraging provided consistency, a successful hunt could change everything, even if only for a short while. So this morning carried a slightly different tone. A few individuals, those with more experience in tracking and endurance, began preparing without saying much. There was no formal announcement of a hunt, no gathering of attention. It was understood through subtle cues, the way someone picked up a tool and checked its edge, the way another scanned the horizon a little longer than usual. A quiet readiness. Tools were simple, but not crude. A shaped stone attached to a wooden shaft, a sharpened stick hardened in fire. Each one carried signs of use, repair, and careful attention. These were not disposable objects. They were extensions of the body, shaped over time through trial and error. Before leaving, there might be a moment brief, almost unnoticeable, where individuals acknowledged one another. A glance, a small gesture, not quite a goodbye, but something close to it. Because even though hunting was routine in a broad sense, each attempt carried uncertainty. The hunting group moved out as the light grew stronger, stepping quietly across the landscape. Their pace was steady, unhurried, but purposeful. They were not chasing anything yet. First, they needed to find. Tracking was not about following a clear path like footprints in soft mud, though sometimes that helped. It was about reading a story written across the ground. A slight depression here, a disturbed patch of grass there, a pattern that didn't belong to wind or weather, and they read it together. One person might pause, crouch, touch the ground lightly. Another would look ahead, connecting what was seen to what might come next. There was no single leader giving orders. Knowledge was shared, overlapping, fluid. Hours could pass like this. The sun climbed higher, and with it came heat. Sweat would form, but it wasn't wiped away in irritation. It was just part of the process. Breathing remained controlled. Movements stayed efficient. Every step mattered, not because of urgency, but because wasted energy could mean failure later. Eventually, signs became clearer. The group slowed even more now, spacing themselves slightly. The air carried faint smells, earth, plants, and something else. Something animal, fresh. Somewhere ahead, just beyond a cluster of low trees and uneven ground, movement. They didn't rush. Instead, they adjusted, circling slightly, positioning. This was not a chaotic chase, but a slow shaping of opportunity. The goal was not speed, it was pressure. To guide the animal, to keep it moving, to wear it down over time. If the animal bolted suddenly, they would follow, but not in a sprint. A steady, relentless pace, the kind that didn't stop. This was persistence, hunting. It could last for hours, sometimes longer. The animal, faster in bursts, would create distance, then slow, thinking it had escaped. But the humans would still be there, reappearing, continuing. Not aggressive, just present, always present. The sun pressed down harder now. The ground radiated heat. For the animal, this became a problem. Unlike humans, many animals could not regulate heat as effectively over long periods of exertion. They would tire, overheat, and eventually they would slow. When that moment came, it wasn't dramatic. There was no sudden heroic charge, just a closing of distance, careful, focused, controlled. The final act of the hunt was quick, but not careless. It had to be done properly. Injury was always a risk. One mistake could be fatal, not just for the animal, but for the human as well. And then stillness. After hours of movement, effort, and quiet coordination, everything would suddenly stop. The animal, now motionless, the humans, breathing heavier, but not wildly, standing around the result of their work. There might be a pause here. Not celebration as we imagine it, not loud cheers or dramatic gestures, but something quieter, a recognition. This mattered, not just as food, but as survival extended, as energy secured, as a temporary easing of uncertainty. Work wasn't over. Far from it. Processing the animal began almost immediately. Tools came out again, sharp stones used to cut, separate, prepare. This required knowledge, precision. Certain parts were more valuable than others. Nothing was wasted. Meat would be divided in ways that made sense for carrying. Some might be eaten right there, especially parts that provided immediate energy. The rest needed to be brought back. The return journey was slower, not because of exhaustion alone, but because of the added weight. The body adjusted, leaning slightly, balancing the load. Steps became more deliberate. Back at the camp, those who had remained would notice their return before seeing them clearly. Movement on the horizon, familiar shapes, and then, gradually, recognition. There would be a shift in the atmosphere, not excitement in a loud sense, but a subtle lift, a quiet acknowledgement that today had been successful. The group would gather, not in a rush, but with intention. The food would be shared, distributed in ways shaped by both need and relationship. Everyone benefited. That was the unspoken rule that kept the group functioning over time. Children might watch closely, observing the process, learning without being told they were learning. The sounds of cutting, the smell of fresh meat, the low murmur of voices, all of it becoming part of memory. As the sun began to lower again, the work would gradually slow, bellies fuller than they had been in days, perhaps, bodies more tired, but in a different way. Not from lack, but from effort fulfilled. The fire would be fed again, flames rising as the light of day faded, and as darkness returned, the group would settle once more into that familiar circle of warmth, of presence, of shared existence. Some might speak quietly, perhaps recalling the hunt in simple terms, not as a story for entertainment, but as a passing of information. What worked? What didn't? What to remember next time? Others would simply sit, letting the body rest. The stars would appear again, unchanged, endless, and somewhere in the quiet spaces between thought and sleep, there might be a lingering awareness, not of achievement, not of pride in the way we understand it, but of continuation. They had made it through another day, and tomorrow the rhythm would begin again. The night did not always remain gentle. There were evenings when the air felt different, thicker somehow, as if the darkness carried more than just silence. The fire would still burn, the group would still gather, but beneath the calm, there was a quiet awareness that the world beyond the circle of light was never truly empty. Somewhere out there, eyes were watching. Early humans were not alone in their environment. They shared it with predators far stronger, faster, and more physically equipped for violence. The fire helped, yes. It pushed back the darkness, created a boundary. But it was not an impenetrable shield. On certain nights, a sound would break the stillness. A distant call, low, echoing, unfamiliar enough to raise tension, but familiar enough to be recognized. Not panic, not yet, but attention would sharpen. Conversations, if there were any, would fade. Heads would turn slightly toward the direction of the sound. A child might instinctively move closer to an adult. Someone might adjust their position, sitting a little straighter, eyes scanning the edges of the light. The fire would crackle, sending small sparks upward, disappearing into the dark above. And then nothing. No immediate threat. No sudden movement. Just the reminder. This land was shared. Sleep on such nights came differently. Lighter. More fragmented. The body resting, but not fully letting go. Ears still listening, even in dreams. A shift in the wind, a snap of a branch, the faintest movement beyond the glow, any of it could pull someone back into wakefulness in an instant. But not every danger announced itself so clearly. Daylight carried its own risks. An injury, for example, could change everything. It didn't have to be dramatic. Not a violent attack or a catastrophic fall. Sometimes it was something small, a sharp stone cutting into skin, a misstep on uneven ground, twisting an ankle, a splinter left unnoticed that slowly became something worse. There were no hospitals, no antiseptics, no structured medicine, only knowledge passed through generations. And even that had limits. If someone was injured, the group adjusted. Movement slowed. Tasks were redistributed. There was no concept of leaving someone behind simply because they became less efficient. At least, not in most situations. Survival depended on cooperation, and that included care. An injured individual might remain near the camp, resting, while others gathered food. Someone would stay close, not necessarily out of obligation, but because that's how the group functioned. Presence mattered. Simple treatments might be applied. Certain plants known to soothe or protect. Water used to clean wounds. Pressure to stop bleeding. These were not random actions. They were learned behaviors, refined slowly over countless experiences. But outcomes were uncertain. A wound could heal, or it could worsen. Infection, though not understood in the way we define it today, was a real and present danger. Swelling, heat, pain signs that something was wrong. The body fighting something unseen. And sometimes the body lost. Death, when it came, was not hidden away. It happened within the group, within sight, within the shared space of daily life. There were no distant hospitals, no separate places where people went to disappear quietly. If someone died, the others were there. What they felt, we can only imagine. But there is evidence, subtle, quiet evidence, that early humans did not treat death as something meaningless. Bodies were sometimes positioned with care, objects placed nearby. Not always, not everywhere, but enough to suggest that death was noticed, and perhaps understood in a deeper way than simple absence. There may have been no words for grief as we know it, but there was likely a recognition of loss, a space left behind where someone used to be, and yet life continued. It had to. The group still needed to eat, to move, to survive. There was no pause button, no extended time to process. The rhythm of existence pushed forward, carrying everyone with it. Fear, too, was part of that rhythm, but it wasn't constant. This is important. Early humans were not living in a state of endless terror. That kind of stress would have made survival impossible. Instead, fear appeared when needed, sharp, focused, useful, and then faded when the moment passed. If a predator was nearby, attention sharpened. Movements became precise. The group might gather closer or move away strategically. Tools would be ready, not for aggression, but for defense if necessary. And often that was enough. Most predators were not looking for conflict. They were looking for opportunity. If a group appeared aware, coordinated, difficult to approach, the predator might simply move on. Conflict was risky for everyone. Even the strongest hunter could be injured. And injury, as already understood, could mean death in the long run. So much of early human survival was not about fighting, but about avoiding the need to fight at all, reading the environment, understanding patterns, moving at the right time, staying together. These were the real strategies. As days passed, seasons shifted slowly. The land changed in ways both subtle and obvious. Plants that were once abundant would fade. Water sources might shrink or move. Animal patterns would shift, and the group would notice. They always noticed. There came a point, sometimes, when staying in one place no longer made sense. Not because it was immediately dangerous, but because it was no longer sustainable. Food became harder to find. Signs grew scarce. The effort required to maintain the same level of survival increased. And so, a decision would emerge, not spoken in formal terms, but understood collectively. It was time to move. Preparation for movement was not complicated because there was very little to carry. Early humans did not accumulate possessions in the way we do. Everything had to be portable. Everything had to justify its weight. Tools, yes. Perhaps some gathered materials. But much of what they needed could be found again elsewhere. The group would begin to shift gradually. Not all at once, not in a single organized departure, but in a flowing transition. One day, a small group might scout ahead. Another day, more would follow. Eventually, the center of activity would relocate entirely. The landscape they left behind would return to itself. No permanent structures. No lasting marks beyond faint traces that would soon fade, footprints erased by wind, fire pits scattered by time, and ahead a new stretch of land, unknown but not entirely unfamiliar. Because while each place was different, the patterns of the world remained consistent. Water flowed in certain ways. Plants grew in predictable cycles. Animals followed their own rhythms. Early humans did not control their environment. They adapted to it, and in that adaptation, there was a kind of quiet intelligence, not written, not recorded, but deeply embedded in behavior, in instinct shaped by experience. As the group moved into this new space, the cycle would begin again, finding shelter, locating resources, reestablishing that delicate balance between effort and rest, risk and safety. And through it all, the same steady rhythm continued. Wake with the light, move with purpose, rest when needed, stay aware, stay together, survive, not as a dramatic struggle every moment, but as a continuous, flowing process, one that didn't demand perfection, only persistence. And as another evening settled in, and another fire was lit against the growing dark, the group would gather once more, not thinking about the distant future, not reflecting on the distant past, but existing fully within the narrow, immediate window of now. Because for early humans, that was all there really was. Morning returned again, not as a sharp beginning, but as a slow unfolding of light across the land. The group stirred, as they always did, in that quiet, unspoken rhythm shaped by countless days before. But something else moved alongside the routines now, something less visible than hunger or danger, yet just as important: communication, not the kind we are used to, filled with endless words and precise meanings, but something more fluid, more instinctive, a blend of sound, gesture, expression, and shared understanding that had been forming long before anyone could name it. At first, it might seem like early humans lived in near silence, but that wasn't true. Their world had sound, just not constant noise. Voices were used carefully, often softly, and rarely wasted. A sharp call might signal attention. A low hum could soothe a child. A series of short sounds might direct movement during a hunt. But much of what was said didn't rely on sound at all. A glance could carry meaning, a slight tilt of the head, a pause in movement, a hand raised just enough to stop someone mid-step. These were all part of a shared system that didn't need formal structure. Everyone understood because everyone had grown within it. Imagine a foraging group moving through dense vegetation. One person notices something, a cluster of edible plants hidden beneath leaves. They don't shout. Instead, they shift their posture slightly, lower themselves, begin gathering. Another sees this and moves closer. No explanation needed. The action itself is the message. Over time, these patterns became more refined. Certain sounds began to repeat in similar situations. a specific tone used when pointing out danger, another when calling others to food. These were not full words yet, not in the structured way language exists today, but they were steps in that direction. The beginnings of language weren't invented in a single moment. They emerged slowly, almost invisibly, and alongside these sounds, something even more powerful was developing: the ability to share experiences beyond the immediate present. Evening, once again, became the center of this quiet transformation. As the fire flickered and shadows danced against the surrounding darkness, the group would settle into that familiar circle. Bodies close, warmth shared, the outside world pushed back just enough to create a space of safety. It was here that something different could happen. Someone might begin to gesture, not towards something in front of them, but towards something remembered. A past event, a hunt from days ago, a strange encounter. The gestures would be simple at first: hands moving, body shifting, expressions changing. Others would watch carefully, because this was not just movement, it was meaning. A reenactment, in a way. A retelling without formal words. A person might mimic the motion of an animal, the way it moved, the way it reacted. They might show how they approached, how the group surrounded it, how the moment unfolded. Their body becoming the story, and the others understood. Not every detail, perhaps, not perfectly, but enough. Enough to learn, enough to remember. This was the beginning of storytelling, not for entertainment alone, but for survival. Stories carried information: what to do, what to avoid, what to expect. They turned individual experiences into shared knowledge. A mistake made by one could be remembered by all. A success could be repeated. And over time, these stories might become more than just practical. They might begin to include elements of imagination. Small additions at first. A gesture exaggerated slightly. A pause held longer for effect. A sound added where none was necessary, simply because it made the moment clearer or more engaging. This was something new. Not just communication, but expression. The human mind beginning to play with ideas, not just react to reality. Children, especially, would absorb this deeply, watching, mimicking, experimenting in their own ways. A child might repeat a gesture from a story, not because they fully understood it, but because it felt meaningful. Over time, these repetitions would shape how they communicated as adults. And then there were symbols, not written, not drawn in structured systems, but hinted at in behavior. Certain objects might begin to carry meaning beyond their immediate use. A particular stone kept longer than necessary. A collection of items placed together in a way that seemed intentional. These were not yet full symbols, but they pointed toward a growing ability to think abstractly, to see something not just as what it is, but as what it represents. This shift was subtle but profound, because once the mind begins to move beyond the present moment, beyond immediate survival, it opens a new kind of world. One where ideas can exist without physical form, where the past can be revisited, where the future can be imagined, and perhaps, in the quietest moments, early humans began to wonder, not in structured questions, not in philosophical debates, but in simple awareness. Looking at the sky, the endless stretch of stars, the patterns that repeated night after night, seeing the moon change shape, watching the sun rise and fall, always returning. There may have been no words for why, but there was likely a feeling of curiosity, a sense that the world followed patterns that could be noticed, even if not fully understood. And with that curiosity came something else: belief. Not organized religion, not systems of gods and rituals as we know them, but early forms of meaning-making. If something could not be explained directly, it might be felt, interpreted, given significance in ways that went beyond immediate experience. A storm, for example, might not just be weather. It might feel like something more, not defined, not named but sensed. And these feelings, these early interpretations, would quietly shape how humans interacted with the world around them, respecting certain places, avoiding others, treating specific moments like death or birth or unusual events with a kind of attention that went beyond practicality. Back at the fire, the group would continue their quiet exchanges, a story retold, a gesture repeated, a sound echoed and slightly changed, each small act adding to a growing, invisible structure of communication. Language was not fully there yet, but it was coming, slowly, patiently, over generations, built not by invention, but by accumulation. And as the night deepened, and one by one individuals began to lie down, their bodies settling into rest, these new layers of understanding didn't disappear with sleep. They stayed, carried forward into the next day, into the next interaction, into the next story, because this was how early humans changed, not through sudden leaps, but through countless small moments, repeated and shared, until something entirely new emerged. And in that quiet evolution, something remarkable was taking shape. Not just survival, but meaning. Time for early humans was not something they measured, but something they felt. There were no numbers to mark the passing days, no calendars carved into stone, no careful counting of hours. And yet, time was always present, moving quietly through everything they did. It revealed itself not in minutes, but in patterns, in changes, in cycles that repeated often enough to be recognized, but never so rigidly that they could be controlled. Morning came with light. Evening came with darkness. That much was certain. But beyond that, there were deeper rhythms. The air itself would begin to change over many days. Subtle at first, a slight shift in temperature during the night, a different quality to the wind, the smell of the land becoming just a little drier or heavier with moisture. These were not things spoken about in clear terms, but they were noticed, always noticed. Plants, too, followed their own quiet schedule. A place that once offered soft, edible leaves might, over time, become dry and empty. Trees that had been bare would suddenly hold fruit. The ground itself could transform, green and alive in one stretch of time, cracked and silent in another. Animals responded to these changes as well. Herds that had once been easy to find would drift away, following water or fresh grazing lands. Smaller creatures might become more active or disappear entirely for a while. The entire landscape was in motion, even when it seemed still, and early humans learned to move with it, not because they planned it in advance, but because they adapted as the need arose. A few days of harder searching for food might not mean much. But if that pattern continued, if the land consistently offered less, if the signs pointed toward scarcity, then a quiet understanding would begin to form within the group. Something is changing. There would be no formal discussion, no gathering to decide, just a gradual shift in behavior. People might begin to explore a little farther from the usual area, pay closer attention to distant features, hills, trees, the direction animals seemed to favor. And then, eventually, the group would begin to move. Not suddenly, not all at once, but in a slow, flowing transition, as if the group itself were part of the landscape, adjusting along with everything else. These movements were not random. Even without maps or written knowledge, early humans carried a kind of mental understanding of their environment. Not precise in the way we might draw it, but rich in memory. A place where water had been found before, an area where certain plants grew during a particular time, a stretch of land that offered shelter from wind. These memories guided movement, and over years, over generations, these patterns became something more stable. Not fixed routes, but familiar pathways. Seasonal migrations, though not named as such, were already forming. In one part of the year, the group might remain near a water source where plants were abundant and animals came to drink. In another, they might move toward higher ground where the air was cooler and different resources were available. The sky itself became part of this awareness, not in a scientific sense, but through observation. The sun always rose in a slightly different place over time. Not enough to notice in a single day, but enough to become clear across many. Shadows changed. The length of daylight shifted longer, then shorter, then longer again. And the moon was perhaps one of the most noticeable markers of change. It did not stay the same. Night after night, it shifted shape, from a thin curve to a bright circle, and then back again. This cycle, repeating over and over, may have been one of the earliest ways humans began to sense longer stretches of time. Not counted, but remembered. A full moon might bring brighter nights, making movement easier after dark. A new moon would deepen the darkness, changing how the group behaved in those hours. These patterns did not need to be explained. They only needed to be experienced. And through experience, they became part of life. Weather, too, played its role. Rain could arrive suddenly, transforming the ground into mud, filling dry areas with water, bringing new growth in the days that followed. But too much rain could make movement difficult, damage shelter, and reduce visibility. Wind could cool the air or strip warmth away too quickly. Heat could drain energy, making even simple tasks feel heavy. Every condition shaped the day, and early humans adjusted constantly. If the sun was too strong, activity slowed. More time was spent in shade. Movements became shorter, more deliberate. If the air was cold, the fire became more important. Bodies stayed closer together. Effort was made to conserve heat. Nothing was fixed. Everything responded to everything else. And in this constant adjustment, early humans developed a kind of intelligence that was not written down, not spoken in formal rules, but deeply understood. They knew when to move, when to stay, when to push forward, when to rest. Not perfectly, of course. Mistakes happened. Misjudgments occurred. But over time, patterns that worked were remembered, and those that didn't were quietly abandoned. Children growing up in this environment didn't learn these things as lessons. They absorbed them by watching, by experiencing, by being part of the rhythm from the very beginning. A child might notice that certain berries only appeared after rain, or that animals were easier to find near water during hotter days. These observations didn't become written knowledge, but they became instinct. And instinct, shaped by repeated experience, became survival. Even the concept of waiting took on a different meaning. In modern life, waiting often feels empty, something to be filled, avoided, or rushed through. But for early humans, waiting was simply part of the flow. Waiting for animals to return, waiting for plants to grow, waiting for the heat to pass. It wasn't frustrating. It just was. Time was not something to fight against. It was something to move with. As another evening approached, and the group settled once again around the fire, these patterns continued quietly in the background of their lives. No one needed to say, "The seasons are changing." They could feel it in the air, in the land, in their own bodies. And as the firelight flickered against familiar faces, and the sky above shifted slowly into darkness, the group rested within a world that was always moving, always changing, but never entirely unpredictable, because even in its changes, the world followed patterns, and early humans, in their quiet, attentive way, were learning to follow them too. The fire had burned lower now, its glow softer, its warmth more subtle, wrapping gently around the group as night settled in fully. Bodies rested close, some already asleep, others lingering in that quiet space between wakefulness and dreams. within that stillness, something deeply human continued to exist, something that went beyond survival, beyond food and danger and movement. Connection, not just as a necessity, but as a way of being. Early humans did not form relationships in the structured ways we think about today. There were no formal labels, no defined roles written in words. But bonds existed, strong, layered, and essential. At the center of these bonds was the idea of the group itself. No one truly lived apart from it. Every individual was part of a shared existence, where actions affected everyone, and everyone, in turn, contributed to the whole. This did mean every relationship was identical. Some connections were deeper, more familiar, shaped by time spent together, shared experiences, and mutual reliance. A mother and child, for instance, formed one of the strongest visible bonds. Infants were rarely out of reach. Held, carried, kept close to warmth and protection. But unlike modern ideas of parenting being isolated, care was often shared. Others in the group, older children, other adults, would interact with the child regularly, holding them, soothing them, keeping them occupied. This wasn't unusual. It was normal. The child belonged not just to one person, but to the group. And in that environment, children grew surrounded by constant presence. They observed everything: how food was gathered, how tools were used, how people responded to one another. There was no moment where learning began. It was continuous. As children grew, their place within the group slowly shifted. They began to move more independently, exploring short distances, testing their understanding of the world. Always within reach, always within sight, but gradually building their own awareness. Friendships, if we can call them that, likely formed in these early stages. Young individuals playing in simple ways, chasing, mimicking, experimenting with movement and sound. These interactions weren't just play, they were practice. Practice for coordination, for communication, for social understanding. And as they grew older, these early bonds might deepen. Some individuals would naturally spend more time together, moving in the same foraging groups, sharing tasks, sitting closer during rest. There was no formal pairing ceremony, no defined moment where a relationship was declared, but patterns would emerge. Two people might begin to act as a unit, not permanently, not always exclusively, but with a recognizable closeness. They might share food more directly, sit side by side more often, move together without needing to signal it. This kind of bond, while not structured in the modern sense of marriage, carried meaning. It created stability, and in a world where so much was uncertain, even small forms of stability mattered. But relationships were not always smooth. Tension existed. Misunderstandings happened. A shared resource might create quiet conflict. A gesture misread. A boundary crossed, even if unintentionally. Yet these tensions, rarely exploded into constant aggression. Why? Because the group depended on cohesion. Constant conflict would weaken everyone. So instead, disagreements were likely resolved in subtle ways: distance, temporary separation, shifts in behavior. Someone might choose to sit elsewhere for a time, avoid certain interactions, and gradually balance would return. There was no formal system of rules, but there were expectations, unspoken, learned through experience. Cooperation worked, disruption did not, and over time, individuals adapted to that understanding. Elders, those who had lived longer, held a unique place within the group, not because they commanded authority in a strict sense, but because they carried memory. They had seen more seasons, more changes, more outcomes. Their knowledge, even if not explained in words, influenced the group's behavior. A younger individual might watch an elder's reaction to a situation and adjust accordingly. If an elder avoided a certain area, others might take note. If they approached something with caution, that caution could spread. Respect, in this sense, was not enforced. It was earned through experience. And then there was affection, not always visible in dramatic gestures, but present in small, consistent ways. Sitting close, sharing warmth, gentle touch, grooming one another, not just for cleanliness, but for bonding. Fingers moving through hair, removing dirt or insects. A simple act that created calm and trust. These moments were quiet, but powerful. They reinforced connection without needing explanation. And in times of difficulty, injury, illness, loss, these bonds became even more important. An injured individual might receive more attention. Others staying nearby, offering what support they could. Not out of obligation, but because the group functioned as a network of interdependence. When one struggled, the others adjusted. Loss, too, affected these relationships. When someone was gone, the absence was felt not just practically, but socially. A space left empty. A familiar presence no longer there during shared moments. The group continued, as it always had to, but the shape of it changed slightly, and everyone, in their own way, adapted. Over time, these patterns of connection became more than just survival strategies. They became the foundation of something deeper. Community, not defined, not named, but lived. A shared identity, formed through repeated interaction, mutual reliance, and emotional connection. And within that community, each individual had a place, not fixed, not rigid, but understood. As the fire dimmed further and the night deepened, these connections remained, even in sleep. Bodies close, breathing steady, the quiet presence of others, creating a sense of safety that no tool or fire alone could provide. Because survival was never just about finding food or avoiding danger. It was about staying together. And in that togetherness, early humans found something that would shape the future of our species in ways they could never fully imagine. Not just a way to live, but a way to belong. Morning arrived slowly, the soft light brushing across the landscape as the group stirred from their sleep. The rhythm of life continued, unbroken, and yet each day brought subtle differences. The tasks that had been so familiar were taken up again, but always with variations, new observations, shifting conditions, or minor adjustments to ensure survival and efficiency. Work was central to daily life, but it was not constant. Early humans were not busy in the modern sense. Their energy was spent strategically, focused on survival, sustenance, and maintaining the group's cohesion. There were periods of intense activity, hunting, gathering, preparing food, tending fires. But these were balanced by long stretches of rest, observation, and quiet engagement with the environment. Foraging, for example, could take hours or even days depending on the season and the availability of resources. Groups often moved in patterns, scanning for edible plants, nuts, fruits, or roots. It was a careful, deliberate process. One person might examine the leaves of a plant, feeling its texture, smelling its scent, testing its resilience. Another might dig gently, assessing the soil, feeling for the right tuber or root. Actions were slow, precise, informed by both memory and instinct. Children observed all of this, often imitating adults in play that doubled as learning. They would gather small berries or leaves, carry sticks, and experiment with tools in ways that were clearly practice for future tasks. Work and play were intertwined, teaching skills subtly but effectively. Hunting, as discussed before, demanded more energy and coordination. It could dominate a day, requiring endurance, patience, and careful observation of the environment. But even then, the hunters were not frantic or hurried. Movement was calculated. Energy was conserved. The goal was not speed for its own sake, it was persistence. Tools were used wisely and carefully. Stone blades, sharpened sticks, and other implements were maintained meticulously. They represented effort invested, knowledge accumulated over time, and the difference between success and injury. Maintenance was a quiet but essential part of daily work, sharpening, repairing, and testing implements, often shared among individuals to extend their usefulness. Between periods of work, there were stretches of rest, sometimes purposeful, sometimes simply imposed by the natural rhythms of the body. People would sit, watch the surroundings, listen to sounds in the environment, or quietly interact with others. These moments might seem idle to a modern observer, but they were far from unproductive. Attention was trained, knowledge was absorbed, and strategies for future action were formed. The concept of time was intimately tied to activity. Work ebbed and flowed according to needs, weather, and opportunity. A hunt might be abandoned if the sun grew too hot, the wind changed direction, or the group's energy waned. Gathering might be paused when rainfall made movement difficult. Observation, reflection, and waiting were as much part of daily life as active labor. Social roles, shaped how tasks were distributed. Experienced hunters and foragers led the way, showing less experienced members what to do through demonstration rather than formal instruction. Everyone contributed according to ability, and this shared effort reinforced community bonds. Cooperation was essential because no individual could meet all needs alone. At midday, the group often gathered to share food, water, and knowledge. There was no formal hierarchy, but subtle social dynamics existed. Elders or skilled individuals were respected and often followed during hunts or exploration. Younger members learned by watching, listening, and participating. The cycle of work, observation, and rest continued, shaping not only survival, but also the culture and knowledge of the group. As the sun began its descent, tasks would shift. Food might be processed for later consumption, tools stored, shelters tidied, or fires prepared for the coming night. Even seemingly simple actions carried importance, ensuring warmth, safety, and readiness for both night and the next day. In this way, early humans maintained a rhythm that was neither frantic nor idle, but purposeful and fluid. Life was measured in cycles of work, rest, observation, learning, and social engagement. Each day reinforced skills, strengthened relationships, and prepared the group for the uncertainties of the environment. The quiet evenings, gathered around the fire, marked the culmination of daily activity. Meals were shared, stories or gestures retold, and knowledge passed along through demonstration or narrative. These moments, combining rest with reflection, cemented both community cohesion and the slow accumulation of understanding that would guide future action. Life was neither hurried nor meaningless. Every task, every pause, every interaction had a role. Early humans lived in a measured flow, attuned to the environment, each other, and the subtle currents of time that shaped their survival. And as darkness enveloped the landscape once again, the group settled into rest, bodies warm, minds alert in the quiet way honed by experience, ready to rise with the next cycle, repeat the pattern, and continue the rhythm of existence that defined their lives. Night deepened, and the fire's glow flickered softly across familiar faces, stretching shadows that danced along the edges of the camp. Life was quieter now, slower, but the mind remained active in ways that were subtle yet profound. Early humans had survived countless days, faced innumerable challenges, and adapted to the rhythm of their world. But survival was only part of what shaped them. There was another layer unfolding: thought, imagination, and the beginnings of creativity. The mind, freed slightly in moments of rest, began to wander. Not in a frivolous way, but in an adaptive one. When physical needs were met, attention could drift toward patterns, possibilities, and the unseen. A movement in the trees yesterday, a distant call of an animal, a strange reflection in water, these impressions were stored and replayed. Slowly, they were connected, compared, imagined differently. This wasn't play for its own sake, but experimentation with understanding. stories became more complex. A simple reenactment of a hunt could evolve into something more, weaving in not just actions, but emotion, cautionary lessons, or imaginative additions. A predator might become exaggerated in size or cunning. A successful forager might become almost heroic, demonstrating methods that could be remembered more easily by others. These narratives, passed through gestures, mimicry, and sound, were the earliest forms of culture. Creativity also appeared in tool use. Stone and wood were not merely functional, they were shaped, refined, and sometimes decorated in subtle ways. A sharpened edge might be carefully polished, a handle smoothed, or a particular color of stone chosen. These were not necessities for survival alone. They reflected attention to detail, aesthetic judgment, and experimentation. The earliest forms of art were likely tied to practical objects, blurring the lines between necessity and expression. Children, ever observant, absorbed these layers naturally. In play, they imitated both survival tasks and creative behaviors. They experimented with mimicry, sound, and movement. A child might fashion a stick in imitation of a tool, exaggerate an animal's movement for fun, or replicate a gesture scene during storytelling. Through repetition and observation, these practices became embedded in both skill and imagination. Even in moments of idleness, the mind engaged with the environment. Patterns in the stars, the cycles of the moon, or the changing flow of rivers and weather were noted. Over time, these observations became internalized. Early humans began to anticipate, plan, and imagine. They weren't counting days with numbers, but they recognized repetition, sequence, and cause and effect. And alongside practical knowledge came belief, not in organized religion, but in a sense of connection to forces larger than themselves. A sudden storm, an unexpected flood, or the appearance of unusual animals might inspire caution, awe, or ritualized behavior. Certain locations may have been revisited with care, or events marked with gestures or objects. These behaviors hinted at emerging abstract thought, the recognition that some things carried significance beyond immediate survival. Social dynamics deepened with these developments. Bonds formed not only through shared survival tasks, but also through shared understanding and imagination. Individuals recognized patterns in each other's behavior, anticipated actions, and learned to cooperate more flexibly. Relationships became more nuanced, not merely based on proximity or strength, but also on trust, experience, and shared knowledge. Even humor, though impossible to define fully, may have existed in its earliest form. Exaggerated gestures, playful mimicry, or surprising sounds could elicit reactions, reinforcing social bonds and reducing tension. In moments of rest, laughter, or its precursor might echo softly, binding the group in subtle ways. Sleep itself became a space for reflection and rehearsal. Dreams may have drawn on daily experiences, reinforcing memory and learning. A child dreaming of foraging might imagine routes, test actions, or replay lessons. Adults, too, may have processed observations and strategies, refining both skill and understanding without conscious effort. Through these quiet cognitive processes, early humans developed layers of thought and behavior that laid the foundation for culture. Not written, not formalized, but alive in gestures, stories, tools, and interactions. Each day, each observation, and each action contributed to a growing repository of knowledge, imagination, and creativity. Life, then, was a continuous interplay of survival and thought, action and reflection, effort and creativity. One cycle led seamlessly into another. One generation absorbed what the previous had learned, built upon it, and added subtle innovations, slowly extending human capacity for understanding, connection, and expression. And as another night deepened, with the fire dwindling to embers, the group settled fully into rest. Bodies aligned for warmth, senses still alert to the slightest danger, minds quietly working through the day's experiences. In these silent, attentive hours, the seeds of imagination, social intelligence, and culture grew, forming the invisible structures that would guide humanity for millennia. The first light of dawn painted the landscape in soft, muted tones, and the group stirred once more. Even before the sun had fully risen, movement began, some stretching, some tending fires, others quietly gathering the first signs of edible plants or water. Daily life resumed its familiar rhythm, yet each day carried subtle differences, shaped by weather, season, and the experiences of the group. What may strike a modern observer as ordinary was, for early humans, a complex web of actions and decisions, all interwoven with survival, social interaction, and learning. Gathering food, for example, was rarely a simple task. It involved careful observation of the land, knowledge of which plants were ripe, which roots were safe, and which fruits or nuts might be toxic. A single misstep could lead to illness or even death. Children watched and imitated, learning not through formal instruction, but through constant exposure. When one adult bent down to pick a particular leaf or tuber, a child nearby would mimic the motion, sometimes with a stick in hand, sometimes with their own small hands. Over time, these repeated behaviors formed a foundation of knowledge, passed silently and reliably from one generation to the next. Hunting presented a more active form of engagement. Predators and prey alike required patience, attention, and understanding of subtle cues in the environment. Movement was deliberate, energy conserved, and cooperation essential. A single misjudgment could jeopardize not only the hunt, but also the safety of the group. Yet, hunting was not constant. Days of waiting, tracking, and observing alternated with periods of rest and foraging. Life was measured in cycles of exertion and calm, not in the rush of constant activity that modern humans often experience. Tools played a central role in these tasks. Stones, bones, and wood were shaped, sharpened, and maintained. Their use required skill and care. A dull edge or poorly balanced implement could render a hunt unsuccessful or cause injury. Over time, tool-making became not only a practical necessity, but also a form of expression. Slight adjustments, choices of material, and careful shaping revealed early humans' attention to detail and subtle creativity. Even in what might seem like inactivity, the mind remained engaged. Observing animal patterns, noting the cycles of the moon, or watching changes in vegetation all contributed to a growing understanding of the environment. These patterns informed decisions, guided movement, and increased the likelihood of survival. Waiting and observation were active, thoughtful processes, even if they appeared outwardly calm or idle. Social interactions were interwoven with these daily tasks. Cooperation was essential for survival. Groups shared the burden of labor gathering, hunting, protecting the young, tending fires, and maintaining shelters. Bonds were reinforced through shared effort, attention to one another's needs, and subtle gestures of care. Grooming, sharing food, and even playful mimicry served to strengthen relationships and build trust. Through these repeated actions, early humans not only survived, they created continuity. Each day built upon the last, forming a rhythm that structured life, guided decision-making, and solidified social cohesion. Ordinary activities, gathering, hunting, resting, observing, were far from trivial. They were the threads of a tapestry that slowly formed culture, memory, and shared identity. Over generations, this continuity became more pronounced. Knowledge accumulated, patterns were refined, and social norms emerged. The seemingly mundane tasks of daily life carried lessons, reinforced behavior, and ensured that each generation could navigate its environment more effectively than the last. And through it all, there remained the fire, flickering softly as night approached. Around it, the group would gather once again. Conversations expressed through gestures, sounds, and emerging symbolic communication replayed the day's experiences. Observations were shared, successes and failures noted, and stories began to emerge, weaving together practical knowledge, memory, and imagination. Even as sleep approached, the mind remained active, processing, rehearsing, and anticipating. This cycle work, observation, rest, and reflection, was the essence of early human life. Each day, each action, each interaction contributed to survival, social cohesion, and the slow unfolding of culture. Life was neither hurried nor chaotic. It was measured, deliberate, and deeply attuned to the world. Through repetition and observation, early humans learned not only how to survive, but also how to exist meaningfully within a complex, ever-changing environment. The ordinary, repeated day became extraordinary in its accumulation. Every task, gesture, and interaction contributed to the formation of knowledge, culture, and social bonds that would echo across generations. As the fire's glow dimmed and the group settled into rest, the cycle paused only briefly, ready to begin again with the first hint of dawn. The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the landscape, and the group moved into another day of tasks, both familiar and subtly new. Each morning brought repetition, yes, but also small discoveries, experiments, and adjustments that gradually reshaped life itself. Early humans were not inventing in sudden leaps, but in quiet, persistent ways, testing, observing, and refining their approach to the world. One area of subtle innovation lay in tool use. A sharpened stone might be reshaped to create a more precise edge. A stick could be reinforced with binding material to extend its reach or improve leverage. Sometimes, an entirely new implement emerged from experimentation, something that worked better for scraping, cutting, or digging. These modifications were noticed and copied, passing from one individual to another, and slowly refining the group's collective knowledge. Even small adaptations could have enormous consequences. A new way to start a fire, discovered by chance, might allow the group to cook food more efficiently or extend their activity into darker hours. A method of preserving meat or storing water could prevent waste and improve survival during scarce periods. Over time, these small improvements accumulated, creating subtle but meaningful changes in how daily life unfolded. Observation of the natural world played a key role. Early humans learned to read subtle cues, the direction of animal tracks, the patterns of bird flight, the shape of clouds signaling rain. Knowledge of these signs allowed for more efficient hunting, gathering, and movement. It was not formal education. It was a kind of living intelligence, honed by attention, repetition, and reflection. Social cooperation remained central. While innovation often began with one individual experimenting, its value was recognized by the group. Effective techniques were shared, sometimes demonstrated, sometimes mimicked without explicit instruction. Trust and social bonds ensured that knowledge spread, while failures were quietly noted, preventing dangerous repetition. Children, as always, were keen observers. Play was intertwined with learning and experimentation. A child might fashion a miniature tool, test its function, and observe the results. They would imitate adults, exaggerate behaviors, and explore variations in gesture, sound, and movement. Through such practice, they internalized the practical knowledge and the creative problem-solving skills necessary for adulthood. Even mundane daily tasks became opportunities for reflection and insight. Foraging could reveal the subtleties of plant growth, soil quality, or animal behavior. Cooking required careful attention to timing and technique. Movement through difficult terrain honed spatial awareness and stamina. In every action, there was an embedded lesson, quietly reinforcing both survival and understanding. Innovation also emerged in the realm of communication. Gestures, vocalizations, and mimicry continued to develop, evolving toward more structured forms of expression. Subtle variations in tone, rhythm, and movement allowed more precise sharing of experience and intent. Early humans were gradually building a vocabulary, not of words alone, but of shared meaning embedded in sound, gesture, and repetition. The rhythm of daily life, work, observation, rest, and reflection fostered creativity. During periods of rest, attention could drift, allowing connections to form between seemingly unrelated observations. A pattern noticed in animal movement might inspire a new hunting strategy. A plant used for one purpose could be imagined for another. Over time, this quiet experimentation expanded knowledge and reinforced adaptability. Even the physical environment shaped innovation. Shelters were improved based on wind, rain, and temperature. Locations for sleeping, storing food, or maintaining fire were optimized through trial and error. Observation of previous successes and failures informed new decisions, slowly refining how space and resources were used. The group's culture, its ways of acting, sharing, and creating, was formed through repetition, observation, and subtle invention. Knowledge was cumulative, not written, but alive in gestures, tools, and behavior. Each day contributed to this ongoing process, layering experience, problem solving, and social learning into a growing, resilient body of wisdom. And as the day faded, the group once again gathered around the fire. Stories were retold, gestures replayed, lessons quietly reinforced. Even the smallest observation, an animal's call, a clever use of a tool, a child's mimicry, became part of the shared understanding that bound the group together. Life continued in this cyclical, deliberate, and adaptive pattern. Every discovery, no matter how minor, every experiment, every shared story, reinforced survival, knowledge, and connection. Over generations, these quiet innovations transformed the daily lives of early humans, setting the stage for greater achievements yet to come. As night enveloped the land, the group rested once more, minds active even in sleep, bodies close for warmth and safety, ready to rise again and continue the rhythm that defined existence. The sky darkened, stars beginning to scatter their faint light across the heavens, and the group settled again near the fire, the familiar rhythm of life marking another evening. Yet, beneath the apparent routine, subtle developments were unfolding. The cumulative effect of repeated actions, observation, and innovation was now shaping more than survival. It was quietly forming culture, ritual, and imagination. Small discoveries from the day were shared. An individual might demonstrate a slightly improved method of cracking nuts, or a new technique for extracting roots from the earth. Others watched closely, mimicking or adapting the method for themselves. Each small innovation reinforced the group's understanding and expanded collective knowledge. Over time, these repeated experiments formed the foundation of culture itself, a web of shared behaviors, techniques, and traditions that would persist across generations. Rituals, though not formalized, began to appear. Certain times of day, changes in weather, or particular events might be marked by repeated gestures, postures, or sounds. A fire circle itself was a kind of ritual space where members gathered to share warmth, observe, and exchange information. These routines reinforced cohesion and provided structure to daily life. Storytelling, still gestural and often improvised, became richer. A hunt retold might include exaggerated movements to emphasize danger, mimic the behavior of animals, or demonstrate a clever tactic. Stories evolved beyond the purely practical, incorporating elements of imagination and creative embellishment. These narrative acts strengthened memory, taught lessons, and entertained, simultaneously binding the group together socially and cognitively. The role of children remained critical in this evolving culture. Play was no longer just imitation, it became a laboratory for experimentation. Children would test gestures, sounds, and tools, sometimes discovering small improvements on existing methods. Through this process, they internalized practical skills, social norms, and the beginnings of abstract thought. Creativity and observation became intertwined, preparing them to contribute meaningfully as adults. Objects themselves began to acquire significance beyond their immediate utility. A particularly smooth stone, a shaped stick, or a rare feather might be set aside, not out of necessity, but for attention or symbolic value. These early symbolic acts hinted at the capacity for abstraction, seeing one thing as more than itself, as a representation, or as meaningful in a broader context. The environment also inspired subtle creativity. Observing animal behavior, seasonal changes, or celestial patterns encouraged early humans to predict outcomes, plan strategies, and adapt their behavior. The moon's phases, the wind's direction, and water flow all became part of an evolving knowledge system that combined observation with imagination. Social relationships deepened alongside these cultural developments. Cooperation, once essential for survival, now intertwined with shared knowledge and understanding. Individuals anticipated each other's actions, exchanged gestures of reassurance or instruction, and reinforced bonds through repeated interaction. Subtle forms of affection, humor, and trust became integral to daily life, reinforcing the group's cohesion and adaptability. Even seemingly mundane tasks carried hidden layers of meaning. Gathering food, maintaining tools, and preparing shelter were simultaneously opportunities for experimentation, observation, and teaching. Each repeated action reinforced patterns of behavior, skill acquisition, and cultural transmission. Life was not simply survival. It was a continuous, adaptive engagement with the world. As night deepened, the fire flickered and embers glowed softly. Around it, humans rested, communicated, and reflected in ways that were quiet but transformative. The interplay of observation, action, storytelling, and play created an invisible scaffold of knowledge and culture, one that would grow in complexity over countless generations. In these moments, imagination began to assert itself more clearly. While still grounded in experience, humans could anticipate, experiment mentally, and create variations on what they observed. A particular animal's behavior could inspire a new hunting strategy, or a clever tool modification might spread through demonstration and mimicry. These small acts of innovation were the precursors of deliberate problem solving and creativity. Thus, daily life, while outwardly simple and cyclical, was shaping minds, relationships, and culture in ways that were profound. Each sunrise, each task, each shared story, and each quiet observation contributed to a growing understanding of the world and of humanity's place within it. As the embers cooled and the night deepened, the group rested once more. Bodies pressed close for warmth and safety, minds active in dreams or reflection, hearts and instincts aligned with each other and the natural rhythms of life. This delicate balance between survival and innovation, routine and imagination, action and observation, was the essence of early human existence. The first light of dawn seeped over the horizon, painting the landscape in soft golds and muted browns. Once again, the group stirred, stretching limbs stiff from sleep, stirring fires back to life, and moving into the familiar rhythm of the day. Yet, beneath these repetitive motions, subtle transformations were quietly taking root. Daily survival, hunting, gathering, maintaining shelter, was now entwined with observation, experimentation, and shared understanding, laying the foundations for language, art, and collective knowledge. Communication, though still primarily gestural and vocal, was evolving. Simple signals for direction, danger, or resource location had long existed, but now these signals grew more nuanced. Variations in tone, intensity, and gesture allowed the group to convey more precise information. A particular call could indicate a type of prey, the state of a water source, or even a caution about terrain. These early conversations were embedded in shared context and experience, reinforcing understanding without formal language. Language itself was slowly emerging, not yet structured or codified, but forming in the interplay between necessity and creativity. Vocalizations, gestures, and repetitive patterns combined to transmit not only immediate needs, but also memory and observation. A hunter's mimic of a prey's movement, coupled with a vocal cue, could teach others about tracking techniques. Over time, these patterns of communication became more reliable, flexible, and meaningful, a rudimentary foundation for what would one day evolve into full language. Art, too, began to appear in subtle forms. Objects were not merely functional, they carried attention to form, texture, and detail. Stones might be smoothed, sticks carefully carved, or rare feathers kept. These items were not necessities for survival, but signaled observation, care, and aesthetic attention. The seeds of symbolic thought, the ability to see one object as representing or embodying something beyond itself, were taking root. Storytelling grew in complexity. A hunt or foraging expedition, once recounted simply to pass along information, could be embellished. Movements might be exaggerated, danger dramatized, or sequences of events linked to lessons about caution, patience, or skill. Through these stories, knowledge was preserved, shared, and reinforced, and imagination began to intertwine with memory. Children absorbed these narratives naturally, learning practical skills, social norms, and the beginnings of abstract thought. Innovation continued in quiet, iterative ways. A new tool shape, a modified foraging technique, or a method to improve shelter stability could emerge spontaneously, observed by others, and adopted gradually. Repetition and refinement ensured survival and efficiency, while also fostering creativity. These small, almost imperceptible steps accumulated, slowly transforming daily life and shaping the group's understanding of the world. Social bonds deepened alongside these developments. Cooperation, trust, and subtle expressions of care through shared work, grooming, or playful interaction reinforced cohesion. Affection, humor, and anticipatory understanding became integrated into everyday life, creating a resilient social fabric. Elders continued to guide through example, transmitting accumulated knowledge and subtly influencing behavior, while children and younger adults learned by observation, play, and participation. Even moments of seeming idleness had purpose. Observing animal behavior, noticing seasonal changes, or attending to subtle environmental cues required attention, cognition, and interpretation. These quiet periods allowed reflection, rehearsal of strategies, and preparation for future action. Mental engagement was continuous, layered, and adaptive, shaping both individual skill and collective intelligence. The rhythm of life, work, observation, rest, and reflection formed a self-reinforcing cycle. Each repetition built experience. Each observation enriched understanding. Each shared story transmitted knowledge. Daily life was neither rushed nor monotonous. It was a deliberate, adaptive process that integrated survival, creativity, and social cohesion. By nightfall, as the fire glowed and embers dimmed, the group gathered once more. Stories were shared, gestures exchanged, and lessons passed silently through observation and participation. These rituals, repeated nightly, created continuity, reinforced social bonds, and embedded culture deeply into the rhythm of life. Even as sleep overtook them, the mind remained active, processing, connecting, and imagining. Dreams may have reinforced memory, replaying sequences of hunting, foraging, or social interaction. The cumulative effect of daily practice, observation, and reflection was quietly constructing a knowledge base that would endure across generations. The ordinary days, repeated with subtle variations, and interwoven with observation, experimentation, and social interaction, were slowly building the foundations of language, art, and shared culture. Each sunrise and sunset, each task completed, and each story told contributed to the development of a human world increasingly rich in understanding, creativity, and connection. And as the night deepened, the group rested, enveloped in warmth and trust, ready for the cycle to begin again. each day a quiet step forward in the slow, unbroken evolution of human thought and culture. The first rays of dawn filtered through the trees, illuminating the familiar contours of the landscape. The group rose, moving once more into the rhythm that had come to define daily existence. But beneath the apparent repetition, subtle transformations continued. Each day, each observation, each experiment, no matter how small, was contributing to a gradual but profound evolution of thought, culture, and social structure. The morning began with the routine of gathering and preparing sustenance. Yet these tasks were never purely functional. Early humans observed carefully, testing variations in technique. A slightly different way to dig a root, a modified grasp of a tool, or a new method of moving quietly through vegetation could make the difference between success and failure. These incremental adjustments were shared naturally through demonstration or imitation, reinforcing collective knowledge. Children continued to play a crucial role in this process. Their imitation, experimentation, and mimicry were not mere amusement. They were vital mechanisms for learning and innovation. A child trying to replicate an adult's motion might stumble upon a more efficient technique, which could then be adopted by others. Play became an early laboratory of problem solving, imagination, and social learning. Observation of the environment remained central. Patterns in animal behavior, the flow of water, the movement of the sun and stars, and even subtle changes in weather were studied continuously. Early humans did not simply react, they anticipated, predicting when animals would appear, when water would be plentiful, or when seasonal changes required relocation, demanded attention, memory, and interpretation. This ongoing engagement with the natural world shaped cognition and planning in ways that would eventually support more complex reasoning. Storytelling evolved alongside these daily activities. Simple recounting of events began to include gestures, vocalizations, and dramatization, enhancing both memory and comprehension. A tale of a successful hunt could be exaggerated to emphasize clever strategies or dangers avoided. Even small anecdotes about plant gathering or tool use carried lessons, providing indirect instruction and reinforcing social norms. Over time, these narratives developed into a rich repository of knowledge, culture, and imagination. Social bonds grew deeper as well. Cooperation remained essential, but subtle forms of trust, affection, and hierarchy emerged. Elders guided through example, while more experienced individuals taught practical skills through observation and shared activity. Affectionate gestures, humor, and playful mimicry reinforced cohesion, while disputes were resolved with subtle social negotiation rather than aggression. The community functioned as a finely tuned network, its members attuned to each other's behavior, needs, and intentions. Even moments of rest were meaningful. Sitting quietly by the fire, watching the flames, or lying under the stars, early humans were processing information, rehearsing behaviors mentally, and reflecting on past experiences. These reflective periods allowed them to integrate observations, anticipate future challenges, and consider novel solutions. Imagination, intertwined with experience, began to expand the possibilities of action, problem solving, and storytelling. Tools and objects continued to acquire significance beyond immediate function. A well-shaped stone or carved stick was both practical and expressive. Rare items, perhaps feathers or uniquely colored stones, may have been kept, admired, or exchanged. These early symbolic acts hinted at abstract thought, the ability to recognize one object as representing or conveying meaning beyond itself. Innovation, observation, and social learning combined to produce gradual but profound changes in daily life. The ordinary tasks, gathering, hunting, resting, observing, were no longer merely about survival. They were shaping thought, culture, and community. Over generations, these practices formed a continuous chain of knowledge, skills, and traditions that enabled humans to adapt, innovate, and flourish. As night approached, the fire glowed warmly, casting flickering shadows across faces and objects. The group gathered, sharing observations, reenacting events, and reinforcing lessons learned. These nightly rituals of reflection and storytelling ensured continuity of knowledge, strengthened social bonds, and encouraged imagination. Even in sleep, the mind remained active. Dreams likely reinforced memory, replayed lessons, and explored possibilities, contributing to skill development, problem solving, and social understanding. The repeated cycle of daily activity, reflection, and rest created a structure in which survival, creativity, and culture were inseparable. Thus, the ordinary rhythms of daily life, once seen as simple routines, were, in fact, the engine of human development. Observation, experimentation, social interaction, and imagination intertwined to produce incremental but lasting change. Each sunrise and sunset, each task completed, and each story shared laid the groundwork for language, art, and collective knowledge. And as the night settled, the group rested in warmth and safety, minds quietly processing the day's experiences, ready to rise once more and continue the unbroken cycle of adaptation, learning, and creativity that defined early human life. Dawn broke again over the familiar terrain, soft light illuminating the contours of the landscape and signaling the start of another day. Though the daily rhythm appeared unchanged, gathering, hunting, observing, resting, the patterns within it were evolving, becoming more complex and intertwined with emerging culture, social understanding, and creativity. Each repetition built upon the last, shaping not just survival, but the very ways early humans thought, learned, and interacted. As the group moved through their morning routines, subtle improvements in efficiency and technique became apparent. A hunter might adjust the angle of a spear throw after observing yesterday's misstep. A gatherer could identify a more productive patch of roots by recalling patterns in soil and moisture. These small adaptations were shared through demonstration, imitation, and participation. gradually refining the collective knowledge of the group. Children remained central to this cycle of learning. Their play was never merely recreational. It was a critical arena for experimentation and skill development. Through imitation, exaggeration, and trial and error, they explored tools, gestures, and problem solving. Even mistakes had value, providing lessons that others could learn from, and reinforcing the subtle processes by which knowledge and culture were transmitted. Observation of the environment continued to shape cognition. Patterns in animal behavior, shifts in weather, or changes in the growth of plants were noted and interpreted. Anticipating these changes required memory, inference, and strategic thinking. By continuously engaging with these patterns, early humans honed foresight and planning, laying the groundwork for more complex decision-making and understanding of causality. Storytelling around the fire became increasingly nuanced. Narratives of hunts, foraging trips, or encounters with dangers were embellished with gesture, vocalization, and dramatization. These stories were not mere entertainment. They served as repositories of knowledge, teaching strategies, reinforcing norms, and shaping the imagination. They also provided an arena for shared reflection, allowing the group to process experiences collectively and pass lessons to younger members. Tools, already integral to survival, acquired layers of meaning. A sharpened stone or carved stick might be admired, refined, or passed along. Some objects, rarely colored stones, feathers, or bones, may have been treated with particular care, hinting at the earliest forms of symbolic thought. Recognizing one object as meaningful beyond its immediate utility was a subtle but transformative step in cognitive evolution. Social relationships deepened in parallel with these cultural developments. Cooperation was essential, but trust, anticipation of others' actions, and subtle social negotiation became increasingly important. Playful mimicry, gestures of reassurance, and expressions of humor strengthened bonds and maintained cohesion. Leadership emerged organically, often guided by experience and skill rather than force, with elders or skilled individuals instructing through demonstration and example. Even in periods of apparent rest, cognition remained active. Quiet observation, reflection, and mental rehearsal allowed individuals to consolidate knowledge, plan future actions, and anticipate challenges. Imagination intertwined with practical experience, enabling creative solutions and subtle innovations in both daily tasks and social interactions. Over generations, these repeated cycles of activity, observation, and reflection gradually produced cumulative knowledge. Simple acts gathering, hunting, tending fire, observing the environment became vehicles for learning, innovation, and social cohesion. The ordinary day, repeated countless times, was slowly transforming the community's capacity for thought, communication, and culture. As night fell, the fire once again became the center of life. Members gathered, shared observations, acted out events, and transmitted knowledge through demonstration and storytelling. These nightly rituals reinforced social cohesion, embedded lessons, and encouraged imagination. Even in sleep, dreams likely played a role in reinforcing memory, consolidating skills, and exploring possibilities. The continuous cycle of work, observation, reflection, and rest created a delicate balance between survival, creativity, and social cohesion. Every day built upon the last, each innovation or observation subtly enhancing the group's ability to adapt and thrive. Through these quiet, persistent patterns, early humans were not only surviving, they were laying the foundations for culture, knowledge, and the social complexity that would define humanity. And as the embers cooled and the night deepened, the group rested once more, bodies aligned for warmth, minds quietly active, prepared to rise again and continue the unbroken cycle that had become the essence of early human life. The morning light crept slowly across the horizon, illuminating the familiar landscape in muted golds and soft shadows. The group rose once again, entering the rhythm of their daily life. Yet, beneath the apparent repetition, the subtle forces of innovation, observation, and social learning continued to shape both individual behavior and collective culture. The ordinary tasks, gathering food, tracking animals, maintaining shelters, were quietly intertwined with the beginnings of creativity, abstract thought, and social complexity. As the group dispersed, some moved toward familiar foraging grounds. Each movement carried observation: which plants had ripened, which soil areas yielded the most nutritious roots, and which locations had signs of animal activity. Subtle adjustments were constantly made. A branch could be used differently to reach a cluster of fruit. A sharpened stone might be held at a slightly different angle to peel or cut more effectively. These incremental improvements, shared through demonstration or imitation, accumulated over time, gradually enhancing the group's efficiency and reinforcing social cohesion. Children, ever observant, were active participants in this evolving system. Their play often mirrored adult activity, but added an element of experimentation. A child testing a new way to dig or a new method of imitating animal behavior could discover a more effective approach. These seemingly small actions were a vital mechanism for the transmission of skills, fostering both practical ability and creative problem solving. The environment remained a constant teacher. Subtle cues, animal tracks, changes in water flow, the movement of clouds, or the cycle of the sun and stars were noted, interpreted, and applied to daily decision-making. Such observation required memory, pattern recognition, and planning. By engaging attentively with these cues, early humans developed foresight, strategic thinking, and an early understanding of cause and effect. Storytelling continued to grow in sophistication. Events were recounted with gestures, vocalizations, and dramatizations, transforming experiences into shared knowledge. Tales of hunts or foraging expeditions might exaggerate danger or clever maneuvers, teaching lessons while also reinforcing group identity. Narratives preserved memory, transmitted cultural norms, and sparked imagination, binding members together across generations. Tools and objects became increasingly significant. Stones, bones, and sticks were carefully shaped, tested, and refined. Occasionally, particular objects, perhaps stones with unusual colors or unique textures, were set aside, admired, or exchanged. These acts hinted at symbolic thought, an emerging ability to see objects as meaningful beyond immediate utility, foreshadowing future developments in art, ritual, and communication. Social dynamics continued to develop alongside these cultural and cognitive innovations. Cooperation remained essential, but nuanced trust, anticipation of others' actions, and subtle social negotiation were increasingly prominent. Elders and experienced individuals guided through example, while playful mimicry, gestures of reassurance, and humor reinforced cohesion. Leadership was often situational, respected, and based on skill and knowledge rather than dominance. Even in periods of rest, cognition remained active, observing surroundings quietly, reflecting on past actions, and rehearsing strategies in the mind allowed integration of knowledge and preparation for future challenges. Imagination merged with practical experience, fostering innovation and creative approaches to both problem solving and social interaction. Over generations, these repeated cycles, work, observation, reflection, and rest, produced cumulative knowledge. The ordinary day became extraordinary in its consequences. Every task, story, and observation contributed to the growth of culture, shared memory, and collective intelligence. What appeared routine was, in fact, a continuous process of adaptation, innovation, and social learning. By evening, the fire once again held the group together. Members shared observations, reenacted experiences, and transmitted knowledge through demonstration and storytelling. These nightly gatherings reinforced social cohesion, preserved knowledge, and encouraged imagination, ensuring that each day's lessons were not lost, but became part of the community's growing cultural fabric. Sleep did not mark an end to learning. Dreams likely replayed events, rehearsed skills, and explored scenarios, further integrating memory and understanding. The cycle of daily activity, reflection, and rest created a continuous framework in which survival, creativity, and social cohesion were inseparable. Thus, what might appear as simple repetition, daily gathering, hunting, resting, observing, was in reality the engine of human development. Each sunrise and sunset, each action and story, contributed incrementally to the formation of language, symbolic thought, art, and social complexity. Life, though outwardly simple, was layered with observation, imagination, and social learning, slowly building the structures that would define humanity. And as the night deepened, the group rested in warmth and trust, minds quietly active, ready to rise once more and continue the unbroken cycle that shaped early human life, thought, and culture. The first light of morning filtered softly through the canopy, casting gentle shadows across the terrain. The group stirred once more, beginning another day of movement, observation, and subtle experimentation. Though the routines, gathering, hunting, tending shelter, seemed repetitive, each day brought slight variations and small innovations that slowly transformed their lives. These incremental changes were the invisible threads weaving together survival, social complexity, and the earliest forms of culture. Morning work began with careful observation. Foragers examined plants closely, noting which leaves, fruits, or roots were at their prime, while hunters scanned for tracks, droppings, and other signs of prey. Decisions were based not just on necessity, but on accumulated knowledge. A slight adjustment, a new angle to dig, a different way to grip a tool, a small alteration in movement could improve efficiency or safety. These subtle innovations, passed through demonstration and imitation, slowly became part of the group's shared knowledge. Children remained central to this evolving system. Play was both mimicry and experimentation, a form of learning with a creative edge. A child experimenting with a stick or imitating an adult's hunting motion might stumble upon a more effective technique, which could then be observed and adopted by others. Mistakes were as informative as successes, teaching lessons to both the individual and the group, and reinforcing the cycle of cumulative learning. The environment continued to teach. Early humans attentively observed subtle patterns, the behavior of animals, the movement of clouds, the flow of water, and seasonal changes in vegetation. Interpreting these patterns required memory, reasoning, and foresight. Anticipating when and where to move, hunt, or gather was a daily cognitive exercise, developing planning skills and shaping understanding of cause and effect. Storytelling, central to the transmission of knowledge, became increasingly complex. Recounting a hunt or foraging trip often involved gestures, vocalizations, and dramatization. These narratives preserved memory, transmitted practical lessons, and reinforced social cohesion. Exaggeration of danger or clever strategy helped reinforce key lessons, while repetition ensured that younger or less experienced members internalized knowledge. Over time, these storytelling practices laid the foundation for culture, imagination, and symbolic thinking. Tools and objects gained significance beyond mere utility. Stones were sharpened and polished, sticks were shaped for specific tasks. Rare or visually striking objects, colored stones, feathers, or bones, were occasionally set aside or exchanged. These practices hint at symbolic thought, the recognition that objects could hold meaning beyond their immediate function. Such early symbolic behaviors would eventually underpin ritual, art, and abstract thinking. Social structures evolved in parallel with cultural and cognitive developments. Cooperation, once necessary purely for survival, now intertwined with observation, shared knowledge, and subtle social negotiation. Playful mimicry, reassurance, and humor strengthened bonds. Elders guided through example, teaching practical skills, while transmitting social norms. Leadership and influence were situational and respected, based on skill, knowledge, and experience rather than dominance. Even rest carried cognitive weight. Quiet periods allowed reflection, mental rehearsal, and integration of experience. Early humans processed what they had learned, considered alternatives, and mentally tested new approaches. Imagination intertwined with practical action, fostering creativity and innovation in both tools and social interactions. Over generations, these repeated cycles work, observation, reflection, rest produced cumulative knowledge. The ordinary day became a vehicle for learning, adaptation, and the development of culture. Every action, story, and observation contributed to social cohesion, skill refinement, and the slow emergence of symbolic thought. By nightfall, the fire once again became the focal point. Members gathered, reenacted events, shared discoveries, and reinforced lessons through demonstration, gesture, and storytelling. These nightly gatherings embedded knowledge, strengthened social bonds, and encouraged imagination, ensuring that learning persisted beyond the day's immediate tasks. Even sleep was active. Dreams may have reinforced memory, rehearsed skills, and explored possibilities, preparing the mind for future challenges. The continuous interplay of daily activity, reflection, and rest created an environment in which survival, creativity, and social cohesion were inseparable, laying the groundwork for increasingly complex thought and culture. Thus, each cycle of day and night, each ordinary action, and each shared story quietly shaped early human life. Incremental changes, repeated and observed over generations, built the foundations of language, art, knowledge, and social complexity. Life, outwardly simple and repetitive, was in fact a sophisticated system of learning, adaptation, and cultural accumulation. And as the embers cooled, the group rested once more, minds quietly active, bodies close for warmth, ready to rise again and continue the persistent, unbroken rhythm that defined early human existence, thought, and culture. The first light of dawn stretched across the horizon, casting a soft glow over the familiar terrain. The group stirred once again, entering the steady rhythm of daily life. Though their actions, gathering, hunting, tending shelters, seemed repetitive, subtle transformations were continually unfolding. Each observation, each small adjustment, each shared lesson was quietly shaping cognition, social bonds, and the earliest forms of culture. Morning began with the careful routines of survival. Gatherers examined leaves, fruits, and roots with attention, noting ripeness, safety, and nutritional value. Hunters scanned the landscape for tracks, droppings, and other signs of prey. Every movement was a small experiment, changing grip, angle, or approach to a task could improve efficiency or safety. These incremental refinements, observed and imitated by others, slowly became part of the group's collective knowledge and practice. Children were deeply involved in this system of learning. Play was simultaneously mimicry, experimentation, and training. When a child imitated an adult's movements, adjusted a tool, or experimented with new behaviors, they were engaging in critical cognitive and social learning. Successes and failures were both instructive, contributing to skill acquisition, creativity, and problem solving, and reinforcing the patterns that structured community life. The environment provided constant lessons. Patterns in animal behavior, shifts in weather, changes in water flow, and seasonal plant growth were observed, interpreted, and acted upon. Such attention required memory, pattern recognition, and planning. Anticipating the movement of prey, the arrival of rain, or the ripening of plants demanded foresight, sharpening cognitive abilities, and reinforcing an early understanding of cause and effect. Storytelling, growing increasingly nuanced, was central to cultural transmission. A hunt or foraging trip might be recounted with gestures, vocalizations, and dramatization. These narratives preserved memory, conveyed lessons, and strengthened group cohesion. Exaggeration of danger or clever strategy emphasized learning points, and repetition ensured that knowledge was accessible to younger or less experienced members. Over time, these stories helped lay the foundations of imagination, shared culture, and symbolic thought. Objects and tools were no longer valued solely for utility. Stones, bones, and sticks were carefully shaped and refined. Rare objects, feathers, uniquely colored stones, or unusual bones were occasionally set aside, admired, or exchanged. These behaviors hinted at symbolic thought, the recognition that objects could carry meaning beyond immediate function. Such early symbolic behavior foreshadowed art, ritual, and abstract cognition. Social structures evolved alongside cultural and cognitive developments. Cooperation remained essential, but nuanced trust, anticipation of others' actions, and subtle negotiation grew in importance. Playful mimicry, gestures of reassurance, and humor reinforced cohesion. Elders guided through example, teaching both practical skills and social norms. Leadership was situational and respected, grounded in knowledge and skill rather than brute force. Even periods of rest had cognitive purpose. Quiet reflection, observation, and mental rehearsal allowed individuals to consolidate experiences and plan for future challenges. Imagination intertwined with practical knowledge, fostering creativity and innovation in both tool use and social interaction. Over generations, these repeated cycles, work, observation, reflection, and rest, produced cumulative knowledge. Simple tasks, gathering, hunting, maintaining fire, observing were vehicles for learning, adaptation, and cultural accumulation. Ordinary days, repeated countless times, quietly shaped the group's understanding, skills, and social cohesion. By evening, the fire drew the group together. Members shared observations, reenacted events, and reinforced lessons through demonstration, gesture, and storytelling. These nightly gatherings embedded knowledge, encouraged imagination, and strengthened social bonds. ensuring that learning persisted beyond the day's immediate survival tasks. Even sleep remained active. Dreams may have replayed events, rehearsed strategies, and explored new possibilities, reinforcing memory and skills. The continuous interplay of activity, reflection, and rest created a system where survival, creativity, and social cohesion were inseparable, laying the groundwork for increasingly complex cognition and culture. Thus, the repetition of seemingly ordinary days was in fact the engine of human development. Every sunrise, every task, every story shared contributed incrementally to language, symbolic thought, art, and social complexity. Life, outwardly simple, was a sophisticated system of learning, adaptation, and cultural accumulation. As night deepened and embers dimmed, the group rested in warmth and trust, minds quietly active, ready to rise again and continue the unbroken rhythm that defined early human life, thought, and culture. The pale light of dawn stretched across the landscape once more, illuminating the familiar features of the terrain. The group stirred, rising to meet another day of survival, observation, and subtle innovation. While the routines, gathering, hunting, tending shelter, seemed repetitive, each repetition layered new knowledge, new strategies, and increasingly complex social behaviors upon the previous day. These incremental changes were quietly transforming daily life into the foundation of culture, cognition, and community. Morning began with familiar tasks, yet even these contained opportunities for refinement and experimentation. Gatherers moved with careful attention, noting which plants were ripe, which roots were safe, and which areas yielded the most nutritious resources. Hunters scanned the terrain, tracking footprints, droppings, and other subtle signs of prey. Slight adjustments, grip, angle, or movement were tested, and effective variations were shared through observation and imitation, gradually becoming part of the group's collective knowledge. Children continued to play a central role in this evolving system. Their mimicry of adult behavior, combined with experimentation, served as a laboratory for learning and innovation. When a child discovered a new method for digging, foraging, or handling a tool, the insight could ripple through the group. Mistakes were as instructive as successes, contributing to skill development, problem solving, and the gradual refinement of community practices. The natural world provided continuous lessons. Subtle patterns in animal behavior, weather changes, seasonal shifts in vegetation, and water flow were observed and interpreted. Predicting these patterns required memory, reasoning, and foresight. Anticipating the movement of prey, the ripening of plants, or the timing of seasonal changes strengthened cognitive abilities and an early understanding of causality. Storytelling, already central to cultural transmission, grew increasingly sophisticated. A hunt, a foraging trip, or an encounter with danger could be recounted with gesture, vocalization, and dramatization. These narratives preserved memory, taught strategies, and reinforced social norms. Repetition ensured knowledge was transmitted to younger or less experienced members. Over time, storytelling not only preserved practical information, but also nurtured imagination and the seeds of symbolic thought. Tools and objects became more than mere implements. Stones, bones, and sticks were carefully shaped for specific purposes. Occasionally, rare objects, colored stones, feathers, or uniquely textured materials were set aside, admired, or exchanged. These early acts of symbolic attention hinted at the ability to assign meaning beyond immediate utility, laying the groundwork for ritual, art, and abstract thinking. Social structures continued to evolve. Cooperation remained essential, but nuanced trust, anticipation of others' actions, and subtle social negotiation became increasingly important. Playful mimicry, gestures of reassurance, and humor strengthened cohesion. Elders guided through example, transmitting practical knowledge and social norms. Leadership emerged situationally, respected for knowledge and skill rather than dominance, and social roles became increasingly complex. Even moments of apparent rest carried cognitive significance. Quiet reflection, observation, and mental rehearsal allowed individuals to consolidate knowledge, test strategies mentally, and anticipate challenges. Imagination intertwined with practical experience, supporting creativity and innovation in tools, social behavior, and problem solving. Over generations, these repeated cycles of work, observation, reflection, and rest generated cumulative knowledge. Ordinary daily tasks, gathering, hunting, maintaining fire, observing, were the engines of learning, adaptation, and cultural accumulation. Each day's activities contributed to the slow but steady emergence of shared knowledge, complex social structures, and early symbolic thinking. As evening approached, the fire once again became the focal point. Members gathered, shared observations, acted out events, and reinforced lessons through demonstration and storytelling. These nightly rituals embedded knowledge, encouraged imagination, and strengthened bonds, ensuring that the day's lessons were preserved and transmitted across generations. Sleep, far from being idle, likely played a role in integrating knowledge. Dreams may have replayed events, rehearsed skills, and explored new possibilities, strengthening memory and preparing individuals for future challenges. The ongoing interplay of activity, reflection, and rest created a living framework in which survival, creativity, and social cohesion were inseparable, laying the foundation for increasingly complex cognition and culture. Thus, the seemingly ordinary repetitions of daily life, gathering, hunting, observing, resting, and storytelling, were in reality the mechanisms through which human knowledge, culture, and social structure were slowly but persistently constructed. Life, outwardly simple, was rich with observation, experimentation, and shared learning. And as night settled and embers glowed softly, the group rested together, bodies close for warmth, minds quietly active, prepared to rise once more and continue the unbroken rhythm that had defined early human existence for countless generations. The pale glow of dawn spilled across the landscape, signaling the start of yet another day in a cycle that had repeated for countless generations. The group rose, stretching and preparing for the tasks that defined daily survival: gathering, hunting, tending shelters, and observing the rhythms of the natural world. Yet beneath these seemingly simple routines, a quiet transformation was taking place, one that was shaping thought, social structure, and culture in ways that would echo far into the future. As morning activities unfolded, subtle experimentation and adaptation continued. Gatherers examined plants for ripeness, nutritional value, and safety, adjusting their methods based on experience. Hunters refined their movements, tested different angles for throwing spears, and tracked animals with growing precision. These small adjustments, shared through observation and imitation, gradually enhanced the efficiency of the group and reinforced the transmission of knowledge. Children remained vital participants in this ongoing evolution. Their play, while often seemingly whimsical, served as a laboratory for learning and experimentation. Imitating adult behavior, testing new approaches, and exploring alternative strategies allowed children to internalize practical skills while simultaneously fostering creativity and problem solving. Mistakes were just as valuable as successes, reinforcing both individual learning and collective adaptation. The natural environment continued to be an unceasing teacher. Patterns in animal behavior, shifts in weather, seasonal changes in vegetation, and the flow of water were noted, interpreted, and incorporated into daily planning. Predicting these patterns required memory, reasoning, and foresight, gradually honing cognitive abilities and shaping early understandings of cause and effect. Storytelling, central to knowledge transfer, became more elaborate. A hunt or foraging expedition might be recounted with gesture, vocalization, and dramatization. These narratives preserved memory, transmitted lessons, and reinforced social cohesion. Exaggeration or emphasis helped communicate dangers, strategies, and social norms, while repetition ensured younger members could internalize the knowledge. Over time, storytelling cultivated imagination and the seeds of symbolic thinking. Tools and objects gained meaning beyond their immediate function. Stones, bones, and sticks were shaped and refined for specific purposes, while rare or unusual objects, colored stones, feathers, or uniquely textured materials were set aside, admired, or exchanged. These early symbolic acts hinted at the human capacity to assign meaning beyond utility, laying the groundwork for art, ritual, and abstract thought. Social structures continued to evolve alongside these cultural developments. Cooperation was essential, but trust, anticipation of others' actions, and subtle negotiation became increasingly significant. Playful mimicry, reassurance, and humor reinforced cohesion. Elders guided through demonstration and example, transmitting both practical knowledge and social norms. Leadership emerged situationally and was respected for skill and experience rather than force, allowing social roles to become more nuanced and adaptive. Even periods of rest were cognitively significant. Quiet reflection, observation, and mental rehearsal allowed individuals to integrate experience, plan for future challenges, and test strategies mentally. Imagination intertwined with practical action, fostering innovation in tools, problem solving, and social behavior. Over generations, the repeated cycles of activity, reflection, and rest produced cumulative knowledge. Ordinary daily tasks, gathering, hunting, maintaining fire, observing were vehicles for learning, adaptation, and the slow building of culture. Each repetition reinforced social cohesion, enhanced skill, and encouraged the early development of symbolic thought. By evening, the fire once again became the focal point of life. Members gathered, reenacting events, sharing observations, and transmitting lessons through demonstration, gesture, and storytelling. These nightly gatherings embedded knowledge, encouraged imagination, and strengthened social bonds, ensuring continuity of learning and culture across generations. Even sleep carried significance. Dreams may have replayed events, rehearsed skills, and explored possibilities, reinforcing memory and preparing individuals for future challenges. The interplay of activity, reflection, and rest created a structure in which survival, creativity, and social cohesion were inseparable. Thus, the ordinary cycles of daily life, seemingly repetitive, yet layered with observation, experimentation, and social learning, quietly drove the development of human knowledge, culture, and cognition. What may have appeared mundane was, in fact, the engine of human evolution. As night settled and the fire's glow dimmed, the group rested together, bodies close for warmth, minds quietly active, ready to rise again and continue the unbroken rhythm that had defined early human existence for countless generations. As the first stars began to prick the night sky, the group lay quietly around the dying embers of the fire. The day's activities, gathering, hunting, observing, and storytelling, had been repeated countless times over countless generations. But each repetition carried subtle shifts, small discoveries, and quiet innovations that accumulated like sediment in the soil, layer upon layer. These layers, invisible to the casual eye, formed the foundation of human knowledge, culture, and social complexity. The lessons of survival had long since become intertwined with social cohesion. Cooperation, trust, and anticipation of others. Actions were no longer just advantageous, they were essential. Elders shared their experiences not only to teach, but to reinforce bonds, to transmit social norms, and to shape the behavior of younger members. Play and imitation among children were not trivial. They were the laboratories in which practical skills, creativity, and problem solving were honed. Even mistakes were incorporated into collective memory, providing opportunities for learning and refinement. Observation had become a powerful tool. patterns in the movement of animals, the growth of plants, the flow of water, and the shifting, whether all contributed to decision-making, strategy, and foresight. Through careful attention, early humans began to understand cause and effect, timing, and adaptation in ways that would ripple across generations. Their minds were no longer reacting purely to the immediate moment. They were anticipating, planning, and innovating. Storytelling, symbol, and the earliest forms of artistic expression had cemented their place in daily life. A hunt or a foraging expedition, once mere necessity, became narrative. A performance, a lesson, a record. Objects shaped stones, feathers, bones, or colored stones were not only tools, but carriers of meaning, signaling care, status, or symbolic thought. The seeds of abstract thinking, ritual, and art were planted in these simple acts, nurtured over time by repetition, observation, and social reinforcement. Even sleep carried significance. Dreams may have consolidated learning, rehearsed skills, and explored scenarios beyond immediate experience. The cyclical pattern of day and night, work and rest, observation and reflection, ensured that knowledge was internalized, creativity stimulated, and social bonds reinforced. Life had become a continuous, layered process in which survival, cognition, and culture were inseparable. Over countless generations, these ordinary cycles, so deceptively simple, produced extraordinary outcomes. Language, symbolic thought, artistic expression, and complex social structures emerged slowly, quietly, and persistently. The foundation laid by these early humans would ripple forward, influencing every aspect of human history that followed. As the night deepened and the embers cooled, the group rested in the safety of shared warmth, minds quietly active, bodies attuned to each other, hearts connected through trust, cooperation, and mutual understanding. They slept not merely to recover, but as part of a larger rhythm, a rhythm that shaped thought, culture, and civilization itself. And so, the ordinary days of early humans, filled with repetition, observation, experimentation, and social learning, were, in truth, the extraordinary beginnings of everything that humanity would come to know. Language, art, social complexity, and culture. Their lives, though simple in appearance, were rich with insight, imagination, and the enduring human drive to understand, adapt, and create. From these quiet, repetitive days, the story of humanity began, a story built not on grand gestures, but on the steady, unbroken rhythm of living, learning, and sharing. The end of this journey through early human life reminds us that even the simplest acts, watching, listening, experimenting, telling stories, and caring for one another, can lay the foundations for civilizations